My name is Renata Cole. I go by Ren. I'm 36, and for 11 years my mother has introduced me at every christening, every retirement party, every 4th of July cookout, the exact same way. This is Ren. She's still finding herself. Sometimes it was gentler. Sometimes it wasn't. At my cousin's wedding last spring, 300 people watched her laugh and say, "We keep hoping something sticks." I was standing right there in the heels I'd bought for the occasion, holding a gift card in an envelope I'd addressed myself, and I smiled the way I'd trained myself to smile, because making a scene had never once gotten me anything except more to apologize for. 4 months later, in a rented ballroom in Millbrook, Ohio, at my mother's 60th birthday party, she did it one more time, and halfway through her toast, the side door opened, and a 71-year-old man, in a gray suit that cost more than her mortgage payment, walked in, without an invitation, found me in the crowd before he found her, and said my name in front of everyone like it was something he'd been saving. What happened in the next 20 minutes didn't just interrupt a birthday party. It took a story my family had spent a decade building about who I was, and it set it on fire in front of the 140 people who'd helped write it. Welcome back to Sweet Payback Stories, where the quiet ones finally get their turn. If you've ever sat in a room and let people describe you wrong because correcting them wasn't worth the fight, stay with me. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And subscribe, because where this one ends is not where you'll expect. I need to take you back 14 months, to the Tuesday everything actually started, long before anyone in my family knew there was anything to start. I spent 11 years at Halloran Home & Farm, a supply chain that started as one hardware store in Millbrook in 1961 and now runs 206 locations across 4 states. I didn't start in an office. I started stocking fasteners on the overnight shift the summer, after I dropped out of a business program I couldn't afford to finish, and I worked every job in that company on the way up: receiving, inventory, regional logistics, vendor contracts, until 18 months ago, when I became Senior Director of Distribution, which meant I decided, every single day, how product moved from 4 regional warehouses into 206 stores without any of them running empty or drowning in backstock. It is not glamorous work. It is exact work, and I was good at it in a way that had nothing to do with being liked and everything to do with being right, on paper, when it counted. My family has never once asked what my job title is. In their version of my life, I work at the hardware store. My mother, Diane, likes that version. It requires nothing further from her, and it fits neatly next to my older brother Marcus, who at 39 owns a landscaping and hardscape company that has never turned a profit in the 6 years he's run it, and who my mother describes, unprompted, as a natural leader, always has been. Marcus has never worked a shift he didn't design himself. I have never missed a Sunday dinner where I wasn't, in some polite or unpolite way, reminded that I was the one who hadn't figured it out yet. I stopped correcting the record around year 3, not because it didn't sting, it stung every time, but because correcting it always turned into a longer conversation about my tone, and never once into a longer conversation about the actual facts. So I let the record stand. I drove the 2 hours from my apartment near the distribution hub to Millbrook on the first Sunday of most months, brought a pie from the good bakery, and let my mother introduce me however she needed to. I told myself that was maturity. For a long time I believed it. The Tuesday I want to tell you about started with an email from a name I didn't recognize in my personal inbox, not my work one. The subject line said, "Only coffee when you have 30 minutes. I almost deleted it. Then I opened it, and the signature block underneath, 3 short sentences, read Edwin Halloran, founder and chairman, Halloran Home and Farm. I had seen Edwin Halloran twice in 11 years, once at a holiday party in a hotel ballroom, where he shook 400 hands in 90 minutes, and once from across a parking lot, when he was touring the flagship store with men in suits I didn't recognize. He was 71, mostly retired from daily operations, and known around the company mainly through the stories long-tenured employees told about him. regional manager for lying about a delivery delay, and hired the warehouse worker who'd told him the truth instead. I wrote back that I was available whenever worked for him. He replied within 4 minutes, "Tomorrow, 7 a.m., the diner on Route 9, not the office, just us." I didn't tell anyone. Not my coworkers, not my mother. I told myself it was probably about a distribution. The diner on Route 9 was empty except for a trucker at the counter. Edwin was already in a booth with 2 coffees ordered, 1 black, the way I take mine, which I hadn't told him. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I've been reading your rerouting proposals for the Nebraska and Iowa corridors for 8 months, he said. "Not the summaries my COO forwards me, the actual documents. You write like someone who assumes the reader is going to check your math, which tells me you check it first." He slid a folder across the table. Inside were printouts of 3 internal memos I had written over the past year, each one covered in handwritten margin notes in blue ink. "I want to know what you think is broken in this company that nobody's told me about, because everybody who reports to me directly has a reason to tell me it's fine." I answered him honestly for 40 minutes, about aging warehouse management software, about a vendor contract that was quietly bleeding margin, about a regional director who'd been padding delivery timelines to protect his numbers. Edwin didn't take notes. He just listened, the way people listen when they've already decided something, and are confirming it rather than discovering it. At the end, he said, "I'm going to ask you to do something, and I need you to say yes without telling anyone, including my son." That was the first time I understood this wasn't about a supply chain problem. That was the first time the ground under the rest of my life, quietly, invisibly, began to shift. His son, David Halloran, was the company's president and CEO and had been running day-to-day operations for 6 years while Edwin stepped back. What Edwin told me next, over a second cup of coffee, was this. The board had been pressuring him for 18 months to formalize a succession plan beyond David, who was capable but who, Edwin in his own words, manages people the way you manage a spreadsheet, correctly and without warmth, which works until it doesn't. Edwin wanted, before he made any announcement to the board or to David, to understand the company from the inside the way he used to, through the eyes of someone who hadn't been groomed for the corner office and therefore had no incentive to tell him what he wanted to hear. He asked me to spend the next year doing something unofficial and entirely off any org chart, reviewing operations across every region, reporting directly and only to him, under the informal title of Special Advisor to the Chairman, a title that would exist nowhere on paper, until and unless he decided to make it real. My actual job and title would stay exactly the same on the outside. Nobody, not my manager, not HR, not my own family, would know. I asked him why me, specifically, out of everyone in a company of 4,000 employees. He said, "Because you've spent 11 years being underestimated by people who had every reason not to, and you never once used it as an excuse to stop doing the work right. That tells me something about what you'll do with more power than it tells me about what you know about pallets." I said yes. I didn't know yet what it would cost me, or what it would eventually hand back. For the next several months I lived 2 lives, which is not as dramatic as it sounds, and mostly meant a lot of early mornings and a locked folder on my laptop labeled, boringly, Q3 vendor notes. That had nothing to do with vendors. I flew to regional distribution centers on my own vacation days, so nothing would show up on a company travelogue. I sat in on store visits as corporate audit, a phrase vague enough that nobody questioned it. I wrote Edwin monthly reports by hand and mailed them to a P.O. box, because he didn't trust company email for this, and honestly, by then, neither did I. What I found wasn't just inefficiency. In the Ohio Valley region, the region that included Millbrook, the region David Halloran had personally run before becoming CEO and still kept a proprietary eye on, I found a vendor relationship that didn't make sense. A landscaping supply distributor called Cold Terrain Solutions had an exclusive regional contract with Halloran Home and Farm to supply mulch, pavers, and irrigation stock to 11 stores, at a markup nearly 40% above what 3 competing vendors had quoted for the same materials in the same bid cycle. The contract had been signed 2 years earlier and renewed automatically, no rebid required, because of a clause David had personally approved. Coal Terrain Solutions was my brother Marcus's company. I sat with that for 3 days before I told Edwin, because I needed to be sure I wasn't seeing what I wanted to see or what I feared seeing. I pulled the original bid documents through channels that had nothing to do with my advisory arrangement, using my actual job's authority to request vendor files, the kind of request that would raise no eyebrows from someone in my role. The numbers held up under every angle I checked them from. Marcus's company had never been the low bidder. It had been awarded the contract anyway, and the paperwork approving the exception carried David Halloran's signature. I want to be honest about what I felt, because it wasn't triumph. It was closer to grief. For years I had believed my brother's business struggled, because Marcus, for all his charm, had never been disciplined enough to run one. It turned out his business had been propped up the entire time by a contract he almost certainly hadn't won on merit, riding on the goodwill of a CEO who, I would later learn, golfed with my brother twice a year at a course 40 minutes from Millbrook. My mother's natural leader had been failing upward inside the very company I'd built my quiet, unglamorous career inside of, and neither of us had known the other was connected to it at all. I told Edwin everything. He read the file twice in silence, and then said the only thing that mattered: I need you to keep doing exactly what you've been doing. Don't confront your brother, don't confront my son, not yet. If you're wrong about any piece of this, I need to know before anyone else does. And Ren, I need you to understand that from here, this isn't just an audit anymore. This is going to cost somebody something real. Sunday dinners got harder after that. In a way nobody at the table could see. I sat across from Marcus, who talked about a new equipment loan he was excited about, and I said nothing, because saying something would have unraveled 8 months of careful, quiet work on uncomfortable dinner. My mother, unprompted as always, told her book club friend at the table that Marcus had the Midas touch, and that I was still figuring out the office thing. I let it land the way I always let it land. It landed differently now. I wasn't the woman being underestimated by accident anymore. I was the woman being underestimated while sitting on information that would eventually change every assumption in that dining room, and there is a particular lonely kind of patience required to carry that and pass the potatoes. 2 weeks later, my mother called and asked me for $11,000. She didn't call it a loan for Marcus at first. She called it helping the family, which was the language she'd always used for money that flowed one direction. Marcus needed new equipment to bid on a municipal parks contract. She said, a real one this time, a big one. And the bank wanted a larger down payment than he had liquid. She said it the way she said most requests, as though refusing wasn't a real option on the table, only a theoretical one that existed to be talked out of. I asked to see the loan paperwork before I gave anyone anything. This was new for me. For years I had simply said yes, quietly, out of some mixture of guilt and hope that generosity might eventually be recognized as competence. My mother hesitated, which told me something on its own, and then said Marcus would send it over. What arrived instead, 3 days later, wasn't a request. It was a notice from a regional bank's fraud department, addressed to me, flagging unusual activity on a business line of credit application that used my social security number as a farm cosigner. I had never signed anything. I had never even seen the application. I called the bank first, not my mother. The loan officer confirmed what the notice implied in careful legal language: an application for a $40,000 equipment line of credit for Coal Terrain Solutions had listed me as a personal guarantor, with a signature the bank's own fraud team had already flagged as inconsistent with the signature on file from a previous legitimate account I held there. The application had been submitted 6 weeks earlier and had stalled only because of a routine verification call the bank made to my personal cell number, a number Marcus apparently didn't have current, which meant the call had gone unanswered and triggered a manual review instead of an automatic approval. If that one outdated phone number hadn't caused a hiccup, I would have found out I was on the hook for $40,000 of my brother's business debt only. When the first missed payment hit my credit report, I drove to Millbrook that night without calling ahead. My mother answered the door already knowing why I'd come, which told me everything about how long she'd known. She didn't deny it. That surprised me more than the forgery itself. She said Marcus had been under enormous pressure, that the parks contract would have solved everything, that he'd meant to tell me and ask properly, and just hadn't found the right moment, and that in the meantime she'd told him it would be fine, that I wouldn't really mind once it worked out, because I'd always come through for the family before. She said this while standing in the kitchen where she'd fed me for 36 years, and I understood, standing there, that she believed it. She wasn't performing innocence. She genuinely believed my quiet compliance for 11 years had constituted a kind of permanent, standing consent to be used, whenever the family needed using. I told her I was calling the police the next morning to file an identity theft report if the application wasn't formally withdrawn within 24 hours. She told me I was overreacting, that it was family, that this was exactly the kind of thing that made people say I'd become cold. I drove home in the dark with my hands too steady on the wheel, the particular calm that comes right before you stop asking a room to understand you, and start acting regardless of whether it does. The application was withdrawn 2 days later, quietly, with no apology attached. I filed a report anyway, because a threat you don't follow through on isn't a boundary, it's a bluff, and I was done bluffing. I also did something I hadn't planned to do. I told Edwin. I hadn't intended to bring my family into our arrangement at all, but the forged application had one detail that mattered enormously to the work I'd been doing for him without either of us realizing it yet. The equipment my brother had wanted to finance was equipment specifically sized for the municipal contract volume, the exact contract type Marcus's company had never been able to service on its own before. The exact kind of volume that would only make financial sense if Coal Terrain Solutions kept its inflated, unchallenged, exclusive supply deal with Howler & Home and Farm indefinitely. The forged loan and the improper contract weren't two separate problems. They were the same problem, and I was standing at the center of both of them by an accident of blood I hadn't chosen. Edwin was quiet for a long moment after I told him. Then he said, "I'm sorry. I didn't know your brother was the same coal. I should have told you the vendor name the day I found it, and I didn't, because I wanted to be sure before I put that weight on you." It was the first time since I'd met him that he apologized for anything. Then for almost anything else he'd said in 8 months. The board vote on formal succession planning had been scheduled for months, deliberately timed to Edwin's 72nd birthday, and it was now 3 weeks away. What none of us, not me, not the board, fully understood yet was how tied together the two threads had become. David had learned, through channels I never traced, that his father had brought someone in for an unofficial review, and though he didn't yet know it was me, he'd begun quietly building a competing narrative for the board, that Edwin, at 71, was no longer sharp enough to be trusted with unilateral influence over the company's direction, and that formal succession should default entirely to David, with no further review required. It was, I'd learn later, David's attempt to close the door before his father could open it any further. A door that, if opened, might expose not just my brother's contract, but 11 other vendor exceptions across 3 regions that David had personally approved over 6 years, most of them tied to friendships, golf partners, one to his own brother-in-law's trucking company. My brother's mulch contract wasn't an isolated favor. It was one thread in a pattern David had built quietly for years, the same kind of pattern, I realized with a cold, specific clarity, that my mother had built inside our family. Different rooms, the same architecture, convenient stories protecting the people who were loved instead of the people who were right. Edwin asked me to prepare a formal board-ready report, not the informal handwritten pages I'd been mailing to a P.O. box, but a full audit with documentation that could survive a room full of lawyers, because he intended to bring it to the board himself, publicly, rather than quietly correct it behind closed doors. "If I fix this quietly," he told me, "I'm protecting my son from consequences, the same way your mother's been protecting your brother from them. I've watched that math fail in this family for 2 generations already. I'm not doing it a 3rd time." I spent 11 nights building that report after my actual full workday ended, cross-referencing bid records, contract renewal dates, and the golf club membership rosters a company assistant had, almost accidentally, mentioned existed for expense reimbursement purposes. When I finished, the pattern wasn't ambiguous. It was 11 vendor relationships across 3 regions, 41% above competitive market rate on average, costing the company an estimated $2.3 million over 4 years in overpayments that had never once been flagged, because the people positioned to flag them had no reason to look for a pattern that implicated the person who signed their bonuses. 2 days before the board meeting, Edwin had a cardiac event at his home, not fatal, a block caught early enough by his housekeeper's quick call to 911, but serious enough that he spent 4 days in the hospital, and the board meeting was postponed indefinitely, while the company's stock, which traded thinly but publicly, dipped on rumor alone. I visited him once at his request, delivered through his assistant rather than a call, because he still didn't want anyone connecting us directly yet. He was gray in a way that scared me, and sharper than I expected, in a way that reassured me. "I don't know how much time I get to fix this the careful way," he said. "I need you to be ready to do it the fast way if I run out of the slow one." He didn't specify what the fast way meant. I understood anyway. He was telling me, without quite saying it, that if he didn't recover enough to run the process himself, he wanted me positioned to run it in front of the board without him in the room. I drove home that night, and for the first time since the diner on Route 9, I let myself cry in a parking lot, not for my career, and not even entirely for him, but for the specific exhaustion of having spent an entire year being the only steady, uncorrupted hand in 2 collapsing systems at once, my family and a company neither of them, so far, knew I was quietly holding together. Edwin recovered enough over the following 6 weeks to return to limited work, against his cardiologist's preference, and entirely on his own terms, which I was coming to understand was the only way he'd ever operated. The board meeting was rescheduled to coincide, by no plan of mine, with a date already fixed on the family calendar, my mother's 60th birthday, the first Saturday in October. Edwin's own event, a formal presentation of the vendor audit and his succession recommendation to the full board, was set for the Monday after, 2 days later, at the company's headquarters, an hour outside Millbrook. I told him about the overlap, almost as an aside, the way you mention a scheduling inconvenience, and he went quiet in a way I'd learned by then, meant he was deciding something. "Rent the hall in Millbrook does formal events too, doesn't it?" he said. It wasn't really a question. I told him it did, and that my mother's party was being held there. He didn't explain what he intended to do with that information. I found out along with everyone else on the night itself. I want to be precise about that Saturday, because it's the night this story started with, and now you have everything that was sitting underneath it. I came the way I always came, with a pie I hadn't wanted to buy, and a gift I'd wrapped carefully out of habit, not affection. I sat where I was seated, at a table near the back, with cousins I saw twice a year, and I let my mother's toast happen the way it always happened, the same practiced warmth aimed at everyone but me. The familiar turned toward Wren. "Well, we keep hoping something sticks," followed by the laugh that had trained itself into that room over a decade. I had, by then, absorbed 11 years of that line. I could have recited the pause before it in my sleep. What I hadn't absorbed, what nobody in that hall had, was the sound of the side doors opening while she was still holding the microphone. Edwin walked in wearing the same gray suit from the diner, flanked by his assistant, and, unexpectedly, David, who I hadn't known was coming, and whose face, when he scanned the room and found me at the back table, told me in 1 second that he understood exactly who I was, and exactly what that meant for him. Edwin didn't go to my mother first. He crossed the hall, past tables of people who half recognized his face from the sign above 139 stores across 4 states, and he stopped in front of me. "Wren Cole," he said, loud enough for the room, not because he needed volume, but because he'd decided, deliberately, that this needed witnesses. "I came here to do something I should have done in a boardroom on Monday, except I've decided the boardroom can wait 2 days, because I think this room needs to hear it first." He turned, then, toward my mother, still holding her microphone, her toast unfinished in her hand. "Diane, I understand you've been telling people your daughter hasn't figured out what she's doing with her life. I'd like the chance to correct the record if you don't mind," he told them. "Not everything. Not yet, not the vendor fraud, not my brother, not the forged loan application, because that part belonged in a different room with different consequences, and he knew it, but he told the hall what he could tell them honestly and cleanly, that for the past 14 months I had been conducting an independent operational review of Halloran Home and Farm at his direct and personal request, that the analysis I'd produced was the most thorough work he'd seen from anyone in the company in a decade, including from people with the word Vice President already printed on their door, and that on Monday he intended to formally recommend to the board that I be appointed to a newly created executive role overseeing operational integrity across the company, reporting to him directly with a public succession pathway attached to it that the board had, until that morning, believed would default entirely to his son. The hall didn't laugh this time. My mother stood with the microphone still in her hand and no toast left to finish. Marcus, 3 tables away, had gone the particular gray-white color of a man doing fast, panicked math about how much of what happened next might trace back to him. I didn't say much that night. I didn't need to. Edwin had said what needed saying, and I have learned, over 11 years at that family's table, that the loudest correction isn't always the one that lands. What I did do was walk over to my mother, take the microphone gently out of her hand because her fingers had stopped working it properly, and say 4 sentences to a room that had spent a decade laughing at a version of me that had never existed. I told them what my actual job was. I told them how long I'd held it. I told them I wasn't angry that they hadn't known because I'd never once given them the real information to know it with, but that I was finished letting a story stand that had never once been true, and that starting tonight, it wouldn't. Then I handed the microphone back to the caterer, not my mother, and sat back down at my table with the cousins I saw twice a year, because I have learned exactly one useful thing at that dinner table for 11 years, and it was that dignity looks like staying calm, not like staying invisible. The rest of the fraud, the vendor contract, the forged application, that came out over the following month, not in a single dramatic scene, but the way real consequences usually arrive, slowly, through people whose job it was to look at documents. At Monday's board meeting, Edwin presented the full audit himself, with me in the room as a named contributor, rather than an anonymous advisor for the first time. The board voted, 5-2, to open a formal investigation into the 11 flagged vendor contracts, and separately, unanimously, to approve the creation of the operational integrity role Edwin had proposed, with me appointed to it on a 90-day provisional basis pending board confirmation. Standard process, Edwin told me privately, not a lack of confidence, just the shape institutions take even when the outcome isn't in doubt. David resigned as CEO 6 weeks later, before the investigation concluded, a resignation the company's public statement called a mutual decision to pursue new opportunities, which was true in the narrow, careful way corporate language is often true. He wasn't charged with anything. The exceptions he'd approved were improper procurement practice, not criminal fraud, and the company's lawyers were, Edwin admitted to me privately, relieved not to have to prove intent in a courtroom. Coal Terrain Solutions lost the Halloran contract in the same review cycle, rebid competitively, along with the other flagged vendors, and did not win it back. The low bid that quarter came in 19% under what Marcus's company had been charging for 2 years. Marcus's business closed its doors the following spring, not from any single dramatic collapse, but the ordinary way most businesses actually die, slowly, once the one advantage propping it up is gone and the rest never existed. The identity theft report I'd filed resulted in a formal warning from the district attorney's office, rather than charges, since I ultimately declined to press the matter further once the application was confirmed withdrawn, and no financial harm had technically occurred. I want to be honest about why I let that part go quietly, not forgiveness, not yet, but because I had watched enough of this story unfold in a boardroom by then, to understand that some consequences do more good landing publicly, and some do more good landing privately, and I got to choose, finally, for the first time in 11 years, which was which. It's been 10 months since the birthday party in Millbrook. I hold the title now without the word provisional attached to it. My mother and I speak, but carefully, the way you speak to someone you're still deciding how much room to make for. She has never, not once, said the word sorry in a way that didn't come wrapped in an explanation of her own hardship, and I've stopped waiting for a version of the apology that doesn't. Marcus and I speak less. He sells equipment now for a company 2 counties over, an honest, unglamorous job, not unlike the one I started with 11 years ago, and some nights I think that might eventually be the best thing that ever happened to him, though I don't say that to my mother, who still isn't ready to hear it as anything other than cruelty. Edwin turned 72 in March. He still calls me, sometimes, not about the company, just to ask what I think is broken somewhere he hasn't looked yet. The same question he asked me over coffee on Route 9, the first morning any of this started. Last month, at a company town hall, a young woman who runs receiving at one of our stores in Nebraska asked me, in front of 200 people, how I got the job. I told her the truth, that nobody in my life believed I had it in me until one person did, and that the only difference between me at 25 and me now wasn't talent, it was that I'd finally stopped waiting for the people who loved me to notice and let the work speak in a room they weren't in. That's the story. One toast that never got to finish, one door that opened at the right moment, and 11 years of being called a disappointment by the one person who never once checked. If this reminded you that being underestimated is not the same thing as being wrong, take that as your sign tonight. Do the work anyway. Let the record catch up when it's ready to. Thank you for watching Sweet Payback Stories. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.